So we're going to look at Unit 3. And this unit is all around children with special educational needs and disabilities. So this is something that you could maybe weave into. I know we did put development and the curriculum type activities together and observation. You could bring in children with special educational needs and disabilities. You could bring in that to teach it holistically, or you could be thinking about how this might follow on quite nicely in terms of your teaching. So if you're looking at child development, then it's kind of an obvious next step, isn't it, to think about atypical development and think about children and factors that may be affecting. So delivering in terms of following on from your development unit, fine, but I would say maybe the assessment of that you keep discreet, because it is quite a big area and something that is really, I think, demands quite a lot of focus and a lot of new learning for a lot of students as well. So I'd be tempted to say if you were teaching it holistically within your development unit, it's all possible, and maybe thinking about how you might have something on its own to really get to grips with special educational needs and disability as a topic area. We've had lots of, there's lots of information on our NCFE careers toolkit, and that careers toolkit's got some nice little video clips. I'll make sure I pop that into an email as well, and that will take you to, you can hear from SENDCO, so you can play all of these things with your learners as part of your teaching and delivery if it helped. So there's things on there that you can use that will complement your teaching and learning as well. So I'd say yes, you could absolutely embed atypical development when you're looking at development, but the factors affecting and the significance of caring for children with SEND, I think, is something that deserves its own time and its own focus, and shouldn't be sort of just wrapped up by looking at environmental and biological factors that might be affecting development. Really deserves that sort of more focused approach. Especially, I think, when we think about the legislation as well, and when we think about legislation and how the SEND Code of Practice supports that. But we'll get into all of that as we go through the different learning outcomes. Okay, so we know about this qualification. I've said enough about that to confuse everybody, but so that just gets us into the zone, and those are the 10 units that we're thinking about, and we're looking at children with special educational needs and disabilities. Anybody teaching that at the moment? Nobody on it at the moment, but will have taught it, I would imagine.
I'm just about to.
Just about to. Okay, excellent. Oh, well, this is timely then. Hopefully we can have a really good discussion. If there's any of the learning outcomes or the assessment criteria that, you know, that sort of stumble you a little bit, or you want some clarity on, then please do stop me as I go. And if any questions come into the chat, Vivette, please do stop me. And I would encourage people to pop those questions in there as well.
Can I RPL, because I teach the SENCO level 3, so some of the questions are very similar from the SENCO qualification.
Yep, you absolutely can. You can bring all that learning forward. What you might want to do in line with RPL policies is wrap a professional discussion around it, just to make sure if there's any different context, if there's any sort of lapse between the SENCO qualification and this, that you're bringing forward that accuracy and that currency of knowledge. So I would, from just in preparation for an EQA, from an EQA perspective, just blend that in with a PD.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Any more questions? Okay, so children with special educational needs and disabilities, and I think sometimes just the sheer size of what that means and the significance of that can be quite overwhelming. And I think we're in a situation where there are more and more children with special educational needs and disabilities within our early years, within our school system. And so it's really, really important that students have a confidence, I think, and are not frightened of SEND, because I think that it's quite easy to be frightened of SEND because A, nobody will ever be a SEND expert. And B, whatever that SEND condition is, we may know lots about certain SEND conditions, but we don't know how that SEND condition is going to impact an individual child. And we don't know how an individual child is going to be feeling every hour of every day, and how that might impact their SEND and how they're feeling and therefore their behaviour. So it is a frightening area, and it's a significant area, and it's an increasing area. And so I think it's about building confidence. So it's great to hear that the SEND co-qualification is being embedded and taught either alongside this qualification or discreetly, and that's something that is worth considering. Okay, so we've got some be able to's here, and as we go through, we'll have a look and see which ones might be a little bit more trickier in terms of achieving, and maybe other forms of assessment that you could use if you're finding that difficult. As with everything, best practice is going to be that hands-on. It's going to be a learner, a student working with babies, children and families that are impacted by SEND. But it's not always possible. It's not always the case. It can be challenging. And so we do appreciate that and we acknowledge that. And so there'll be other ways of collating this evidence. I just think the greatest confidence builder is being able to actually engage with the children and with their families. So it explores legislation and guidance to support the increasing awareness and confidence of the early years educator to support babies, children and their families when facilitating nurturing environments for babies and children with SEND. Okay. There's a lot really in that. So let's have a look. So obviously we know that those learning outcomes that are beginning with understand or know about are the ones that are knowledge based. So that means that actually you can use a range of different assessment methods, and those could include assignments. We do have those non-mandatory assignments in the tutor guide that can support you and that you can use at your leisure and just go in for hints and tips, or actually use the assignment in its entirety or just in parts, or not at all. So it's knowing about legislation and guidance, and a lot of learners will probably find this very, very boring. But when I was having a conversation with students many years ago, when we were thinking about the SEND code of practice as it was at the time, and that SEND code of practice, just being aware of the 4 broad areas of need within that guidance is actually really, really, really supportive. Because if we're suddenly asked or suddenly exposed to working with babies and children who may have a special educational need or disability, the first thing that might help us is actually, what is this main category of need? So don't be put off by legislation and guidance. Really look at the SEND code of practice, which is the guidance that will really support you and your learners with this particular learning outcome. And so you've got communication, sensory and physical, mental health is in there, and emotional well-being, and sort of cognitive and interaction. So whatever those 4 areas are, I think I might have missed one, but whatever those 4 areas are and what they describe, a child with SEND will fit into one. There'll be a main need, and then there may be some overlap because one thing may well impact another. But one way of really bringing that legislation alive is through that SEND code of practice, and just focusing on those 4 areas of need will be enough. There's no way we'll ever be able to interpret and fully understand all of that guidance, but just feeling comfortable and confident those 4 broad areas of need is really useful. And it will help you as a learning tool in terms of, okay, here when we might use some scenarios and different conditions to be able to help us to focus. But here we are, here's Janet. This is Janet's special educational needs. Where does it best fit? Where are you going to start with your focus? Oh, I think it goes with cognitive and interaction. And then you can see, might it overlap with any other areas? So it's one way of bringing that legislation and guidance to life, really. Okay, so, and I always think that's difficult. Anything to do with legislation, policy and procedure, it's not the sort of most exciting thing to teach, but using scenarios can be useful. Vivette.
I'm just wondering, could you just clarify the 1.1 though, because with the legislation and frameworks, etc., but because it says early years, including for children and young people, what are we looking for in terms of detail and age range? And is it just knowing that it extends, or do they have to include it?
It's literally just knowing that it extends. So we're not looking for something that is discrete to the early years. We're looking for that sort of from birth to 25. We're looking at that SEND code of practice. So it's really just to identify that, and there should be some information in the range. So we'll go on to look at that will help to clarify it more. Now I know it only it talks there about identifying, but you could wrap around 1.1 and 1.2. Oh, and I didn't even have to think because they're bullet pointed in 1.2. But I got most of them. If you look at those are the most important things. And if your students, if anybody is lacking confidence working with or going into a special educational needs type provision or working one-to-one with a child with SEND, then actually those 4 broad areas of need can help with the confidence. Okay, I'm going to be involved in the care and education of Janet. Which category does this need best fit into? And then you can find out a little bit more about how you can support, and that will help as well in terms of being able to use a graduated approach, think about local offer, think about working with others, and really give you somewhere to start. But of course, as we all know, and I will go through the assessment criteria, but as we all know, every child is unique. So when we think about this, yes, we do need to have the knowledge. Yes, that does help. And I think it helps to build confidence if we're able to say, this is the condition, this is the main category, so this is how it may affect. That gives us a confidence with the SEND, and then we have to really tune in to Janet. So what's Janet like? Let's get to know Janet. We need to know Janet as a person, as a young child, and then we're bringing all of this into that holistic mix. And so scenarios around things like that can be really useful. So that we're going away from that medical model and we're really focusing on that social model in terms of child first and then what's impacting that child. And it might help when we're dealing with SEND to think about those categories. Let's find a main category, then let's think about how they may overlap, then let's try and think how we could make things, develop strategies to support the child to reach their full potential. And that's bringing in all of that knowledge of the child's interests, the factors that might be impacting them on a wider scale. Not should, but could. In terms of that case study, I'm just saying that you could, because I think it might help to bring that legislation alive. Is that okay?
Right, there's a question here. Am I understanding 1.2 correctly? The students should use a case study and then identify the main category of need for this case study.
Well, they could. So I'm not going to say should or must, but it might be a way of really tuning into what we're trying to develop in terms of learning for our students with learning outcome 1, which is all about legislation and guidance. So I think if you were developing a case study around a particular need, what category. So you're exploring, you're already identifying for 1.1. In 1.2, you're exploring all those different areas of need, but you might have one specific category. So you're then looking at how the others might overlap, or you might well do a series of different case studies to help with that understanding. But I think it can be difficult to try and transfer knowledge from a legal document or a statutory guidance document into something that makes sense and something that you can practically apply. So what we're trying to do is not just say, right, here you are, here's the code of practice, there you go, those are the 4 broad areas of need, get to know them. What we're saying is get to know them so that you can apply them, get to know them so that you feel more confident. So it's just making that learning count and be applicable to your students, really. Okay, we are then summarising the implications of legislation and guidance for practice in an early years setting to appreciate the legal rights of each individual child according to their current and future needs. So again, can you see how this could lend itself? I mean, it lends itself to a case study beautifully, but there will be a non-mandatory task for all the knowledge outcomes anyway. So you could just look in the tutor guide and go through that and see. But I can really imagine, depends how you're teaching it, it depends how you're delivering it, but you could use scenarios, written scenarios as part of an assignment, or you could really explore role play and scenarios, again, depending on how you're putting your learning together. But you can see how all of those overlap really, really well. They're broken down, but they all overlap. And then describe the following features of effective practice for babies and children with SEND, and we have a bullet pointed list there. So we've got early help and early intervention, the graduated approach, that local offer. Oh, I thought there was one more. Oh no, they do all fit on there. Yeah, so there we go. And that might be something where the students do a little bit of research for that, maybe. So what do we understand by early help and early intervention? That might be something that either they research or is part of that case study or something that you've done in those early sessions. And then thinking about the graduated approach and how you would work with others to be able to implement that sort of coherent approach to making sure that the baby and child at the centre was getting the care that they needed in a consistent way from different professionals and so on. What strategies are we using? Are they working? So if you're not familiar with the graduated approach, there'll be some information in the tutor guide, but also it'll be easy to be able to find a diagram of that flow chart by just looking at that on the internet. And then the early years offer and that local offer, and maybe thinking about that scenario again and thinking, okay, so what do we have available in your local area to be able to support this particular child under these particular circumstances? So already you're learning about this and you're getting the theory behind it, but you're getting that theory in a way that will give you or give your students the ability and the confidence to transfer that into practice, which is what we are gaining this knowledge for. That's why we want the knowledge. It's not knowledge that we want to recall for a test or an assignment or an exam. This is about knowledge that is going to be applied. So it's about the confidence. It's about the confidence to know that there is guidance. What is that guidance? Giving your learners a little bit of a head start into, well, how could I use it? And then thinking about what's available, what rights do I have or does that child have? And in terms of that early intervention and that graduated approach and that local offer to make sure that that child is getting the best education and care that they can. Any questions about learning outcome 1?
So there is another question here. Can I see it? the criteria asked for babies and children, is it important to distinguish between the age ranges, or is one age group acceptable?
One age range is acceptable within your case study, and then what you might want if you're using a case study, because what you're really doing is just thinking about children in the early years, and we tend to just use babies and children to be able to sort of cover that from birth to 5. So so if you're not using a case study, then you can have a look. There'll be that mandated task, non-mandated task that's in the tutor guide that you could refer to, or you could literally take these assessment criteria and you could support your students to generate evidence discreetly if you wanted to. I just think sometimes it can be nice if you can bring those things together so that they're making sense, because if you like, what we're trying to do is know about legislation and guidance for children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. Now, that's because we're saying children and young people because the guidance stretches from birth to 25. We're knowing about the legislation that exists for children with SEND, basically, and to be able to know about that in a way that makes sense in early years practice is being seen through the way those assessment criteria are broken down. You could take each one discreetly, that's fine, or you could try and bring things together. And you don't have to use a case study for that. You could do research, you could do presentation, you could do written, you could use any of those different forms of assessment that you know your students best. So whatever works for you. What I'm talking about now is literally a guide. It's not a mandatory approach at all. Okay. Right, so move on to learning outcome 2. So we're still looking at the knowledge here, and we are understanding that there are appropriate strategies for supporting a baby or child with SEND. So again, this is something that we think, okay, that sounds easy enough, but in reality, there's so many things, it's impossible to know what to do in terms of, everything. So what we're thinking about here is those fundamental approaches in terms of the significance of getting to know the child, the significance of always creating an inclusive environment. And an inclusive environment isn't something that we just do if we're looking and caring and educating children with SEND. An inclusive environment is something that gives somebody a sense of belonging. Somebody described inclusion to me, an inclusive practice, as a feeling, not a physical thing. And that's quite interesting. And we had a really good chat about that. So if a sense of inclusivity is the way you make somebody feel, that's something that's applicable to everybody. It's applicable to your staff, it's applicable to the children that you're working with, and it's not just about making sure that children with SEND are included by adapting activities and developing different approaches. That's part of it, but to feel a sense of belonging and to facilitate that inclusive environment is much bigger than that. So that's an interesting sort of area to explore, I think. So inclusivity as a feeling rather than something that's physically facilitated or created. Interesting. And then we're thinking about, okay, so bringing it back now to how do we make sure we adapt that inclusive environment to ensure that children with SEND are able to participate, contribute, develop, and fulfill potential and learn and progress and everything that any child is entitled to. Then we need to bring that now. How do we adapt that? How can we explain inclusivity in relation to children with SEND? And I think 2.1 is massive in terms of let's understand inclusivity and let's understand adaptive pedagogy, adaptive teaching and learning, how we actually then create that sense of belonging through participation, contribution, that more of an equality of opportunity and equity feeling. And but the sense of inclusivity is something that all children, that everybody needs. Yeah, I quite enjoyed that debate. And then in 2.2, explain how a delay in a baby's or child's learning and development does not necessarily indicate a special educational need or disability, and could just be a gap in their knowledge and understanding. And of course, what we're doing here is perhaps reminding our students of the early years foundation stage, of those 4 guiding principles, thinking about individual pace, individual rate, and being able to appreciate that actually that's okay. You know, maybe we're going through the pattern and we're going through the stages, but we're going through them at a different rate, at a different pace. Also remember that children's physical development might be absolutely fantastic, and linguistic, their language development, might not, and things catch up with each other. And those 3 prime areas of the EYFS, I refer to them as 3 pillars, because I think those 3 pillars, it's almost like one of those games where you're knocking them down. They're very rarely aligned, especially in the early years, and especially in those really formative years, sort of up to about 2 to 3 years, when there's this struggle between personal, social, and emotional development, communication, and not being able to express ourselves as we might, and also with the physical, personal, social, emotional, and communication and language. And these 3 pillars need to be stabilized. So you know, it's really important we can talk about those, and we can talk about the fact that not all of these things will be aligned, not all of these things will happen at the same time. And if a child is really excelling in what we expect in their physical development, for example, but maybe not in the others, then it doesn't necessarily mean a send, but what it does mean is that gives us a clue as to how we can support that child and what that child's needs are. So we're not just waiting for them to catch up. We're not just waiting to see if it's if there's something that we can't do. We're doing that, and if those things then reveal more concern to you as a professional, then of course we go to the next stage of thinking about working with the SENDCO, thinking about early intervention, and so on. But it's really just asking the student in 2.2 to be thinking about rate and pace and the uniqueness of each baby, of each child, and not jumping in when those pillars don't align. And there can be very good reason why those pillars don't align, especially in the early years with everything that's going on, but also in terms of transition, in terms of family circumstance and change. So it's about, again, really knowing that child and not making those assumptions. Likewise, we can't just turn a blind eye to something. If we're concerned about something and we're not sure whether it's just this alignment or whether actually it could be a special educational need, then what do we do? And bringing, you know, talking about the fact that we've got to observe, we've got to monitor, we've got to really tune into that child, we've got to really develop that relationship with the family to be able to make sure that we're doing our best and we have the best information about that child at our fingertips. So again, it's a small statement, but there's a lot of teaching and learning that you can unpack from that. And then we're taking that a little step further by in 2.3 here, by describing how scaffolded learning strategies and the design of flexible, adaptive daily routines and expectations can help babies and children to progress and overcome perceived delay in learning and development. So that was just what we were talking about there in terms of, well, we can't just say, oh, every child's different. Every child's developing at their own rate and pace, because that's what we've learned in our studies. We do have to make a concerted effort to make sure that we are supporting those children, and we are getting to know them, thinking about what area am I most concerned with then? Is it Is it their personal, social, and emotional development? Is it their physical development, in particular their fine manipulative skills? What is it that I'm worried about? You can only do that if you know the child. You can only get to know the child if you get to know the family. And you can only really be the best informed if you use all of your knowledge of child development, and you're able to apply that maybe through observation, maybe through monitoring activities at different stages and so on. So again, it's about giving learners advice in terms of how they could actually do that. So we don't just say, you need, oh, they'll catch up, they'll be all right. What are you concerned about? Why are you concerned about that? Let's not jump to any conclusions. Let's get to know that child a little bit better, do some focused observations and so on, adapt our activities a little bit, maybe do some more adult-led with that child, and then take those next steps. And never being afraid to seek support from the SENDCO. That's really, really important, that individual member of staff, sorry, I hope you can't hear the dogs, that individual member of staff or that student is able to feel confident to be able to approach the SENDCO and to have those kind of conversations. And again, likewise with the behaviour there in 2.4, explaining that changes in behaviour are not necessarily a sign that a baby or child has SEND. And we know that, you know, when we know the children really well, and we've got that really good rapport with the family, we've got that trusting relationship, they will tell us, Janet's really tired today, or she's been off the wall this morning, I don't know what's wrong. We get all that inside information, so we're able to just keep a third eye on Janet. She's not feeling herself today, and you'll tell members of staff and they'll report back to key person and all of that sort of thing. But those changes in behaviour are often a direct expression of not the of regulation and not being in control of overwhelming feelings. Could be as simple as being tired. It could be as extreme as not coping with a particular circumstance or situation, and there are lots of things that you can do. So again, it's not necessarily a SEND, but it is something that we should focus in. We don't ignore it just because it's not something that we recognise as a special educational need. It is a need of that child within that period of time. And if that becomes more of a concern, then perhaps it could be related to one of those 4 broad areas of need. Perhaps I do need to speak to the SENDCO. And I would always encourage your learners to know what that SENDCO role is, and to know who that person is, and to share some of those concerns so that they too can be involved in terms of, okay, how's Janet doing? Are you still worried? Are you still concerned? Have you spoken to the family? Okay, let me come in and maybe do some further observations and so on. So it's about applying all of this knowledge to practice. Any questions on learning outcome 2?
Seems everyone's got that one, Janet.
Okay. I get carried away, sorry. And then again, I'm just conscious of the time now because I'm rambling. Understanding that there are specialist aids, resources, equipment available to support babies and children. Very straightforward, I think, in terms of identifying a range of specialist equipment, specialist resources, summarising the role of the SENDCO, and that importance, as we've just been talking about, the partnership working for effective support of children with SEND. So we're building on everything that we've been learning in LO1 and LO2 in particular there, and bringing out that professional role of the SENDCO. And you can actually get a list of the identified role of a SENDCO by looking on the Department for Education's .gov website. And if you put in the role of the SENDCO, DFE, role of the SENDCO, that will bring up some criteria. It's the criteria that's embedded in that level 3 award, it's the SENDCO award that Lisa was talking about earlier, and it will list those sorts of different occupational roles. So again, a student will be able to take those and think about summarising those for 3.2 specifically. Thanks, Paula. Now we get onto the skills, and it's always a bit of a tricky one with SEND, because as I said at the beginning, the best way to actually see if a learner is competent and confident with something is to observe them. But it's not always possible, and it's not always the best thing to do, depending on that child and those circumstances. So here we're asking to be able to explain and apply the early years foundation stage statutory framework and the SEND code of practice in relation to the care and education of babies and children with SEND through a graduated approach. So this is a big ask if your learners are not specifically working with children who've got a recognised SEND. So let's have a look. So reflecting on how policy and procedure in the early years setting adheres to the EYFS framework and the SEND code of practice. So that's really investigating the policy. What are the policies and procedures for equality, for special educational needs within the early years setting? So maybe using that as a work product and having a reflective, either a discussion or having a reflective account there. Within that, it's asking the learner to think about how it relates to the SEND code of practice and all policies within early year settings in relation to SEND and equality should include the SEND code of practice, and should also then therefore talk about the graduated approach and how we work with others to plan to make sure children's needs are being met, and to have this cycle of revisiting that to make sure we're giving children the best possible opportunities as they grow and as they change. If the code of practice or the graduated approach is not in your particular policy, then discussing that and bringing in the learning and having the reflection of a policy, a real policy, and then talking about how the SEND code of practice and the graduated approach may be used as part of the procedures when you're working with children with SEND. So you could do it hypothetically. And then 4.2 is asking your learners to advocate for children's individual learning, considering their current development and uniqueness, including those with SEND and English as an additional language, creating an effective and supportive emotional environment that enables the child to feel safe, secure and respected, and to experience a sense of well-being, maintaining and prioritising the individual child's voice. So can you see how 4.1 in particular, and when we talked about an inclusive environment, could go together? So thinking about how the knowledge and skill might go together here. Advocating for children. So again, if there are no children with SEND in that setting where your learners are working, then talking about how, going back to that policy, what would you do? How could you advocate for children's individual learning? Is there any situations or individual children that you can think of? Talk to your placement supervisors. Is there anything that you can reflect on? What do they do to enable this to happen? What does the policy and what do the procedures say about how you would achieve this? So if it's not something that your student can do directly, because there are no children with SEND at that setting, then you can use those other methods, but anchor the theory to the practice. What would you do? How does the policy help you to do this? How do the procedures support you to do this? And we're carrying on that work, but now more specifically in terms of partnership working. And we've talked about the significance of partnership working already. And about your own professional skills and behaviour when liaising with parents and carers of children with SEND. So thinking there about, the importance of maybe difficult conversations, being sensitive to the needs of parents and carers, being aware of the pressures that parents and carers might be under, and that wider family pressure as well, that may, not necessarily, but may exist when families are caring and educating a child with SEND. And remembering actually that you're advocating first and foremost for the child. So sometimes there are difficult conversations to be had in terms of bringing in the SENDCO and any additional help that may be required as part of an intervention plan. But you do that in partnership with the parent. That's the most important thing when you're thinking about supporting that child's next step. But you don't give up because the parent doesn't want to. You have to work sensitively. How do you do that? Okay, so effectively carrying out a child's care plan. Now, this is something that could be difficult if your learners aren't working with a child with SEND. But what we're really asking the students to do here is to think about, what do we understand? What could an initial assessment look like? How would we implement, and how would we have that ongoing review? So what we're really doing is taking apart that graduated approach. So we're looking, you could reflect on something, you could use a case study. If you're not able to do something hands-on and work with or shadow somebody, a SENDCO within the setting, then you could talk to the SENDCO, you could use a work product, you could look at something that's been sort of developed for a child previously, and you could talk about how that is used and implemented. Or you could go back to that graduated approach and you could explain, or the learner, could explain how these things work. What was the initial assessment like? How do you find out about those child's initial needs? And then what are the stages within that graduated approach? So this is putting the practice of the knowledge of a graduated approach into practice, if you like.
Janet, there's been a question here. Could we consider using a reflective professional discussion where the learner is running the questions and discussion alongside the SENCO to cover some of these skills, particularly if they aren't working with children with SEN directly?
Absolutely, and I think that's a lovely idea. The more learning that student has in terms of competence and being able to feel confident approaching a SENDCO who they might not necessarily have those conversations with, especially as a student. An absolutely great idea, because you're going to glean lots of information, and it's the SENDCO, it's part of that SENDCO's role to share and cascade that information. So yeah, brilliant. It's a big ask, and the Department for Education's has acknowledged that SEND is there's an increase in children with SEND in our early years and school settings today. We need to make sure that we are feeling confident to be able to support those children, and of course, above all, those children deserve that. So this is about really spending time exploring those different pieces of the SEND code of practice, but also putting them into practice. And there's nobody better than the SENCO, or there shouldn't be, for being able to guide your learners on that, as well as you, of course. So yeah, good idea. Okay, and then we are going back to that environment. So facilitating an environment that meets the individual needs of children in an early years setting. Now, here we're thinking about an environment that is inclusive. Okay, so not necessarily, there might not be any children with SEN there. We're facilitating an environment that meets the individual needs of children in an early years setting. If there are children within that setting that have got SEND, then we talk about how we adapt that environment, perhaps. If there are not, then we can talk about how we might. And we can use those, the policies, procedures, or indeed refer back to that code of practice and think about how we might create an environment and how we could adapt our environment for somebody in one of those broad areas of need. We could discuss how the setting supports babies and children to develop a positive sense of their own identity and culture, valuing race, religion, and these are all sorts of things that actually are important for all children. Looking at the next one, a sense of well-being, being secure, being respected. What we're talking about here is, why are these things important? when we're facilitating that nurturing environment, when we're creating a feeling or a sense of inclusivity. And how do we adapt that for our children with SEND? We've learned about that. We've talked about that in terms of the knowledge. Now we're actually supporting children to do that. So you can talk very generally and then bring it back to, and what would I do if I was adapting my this environment for children with SEND? And if it helps, you could bring a particular SEND or area of need within those conversations. If you're working with a child with SEND, of course, then you could use that as a particular example. It's really about bringing that theory and that knowledge and that practice together. And then here it's asking us to use specialist aid resources and equipment available to support babies and children with SEND. And this one is probably one that definitely relies on simulation. And there's no way you can have a go with anything and everything, but if there's anything that you've got there, whether that's something to support sensory with hearing and vision, whether that's something to support communication, whether that's something that might support a sort of accessibility from a physical disability need. Again, think about those 4 broad areas of need, and within the code of practice towards the back you'll find that there are some hints and tips of things that you could do and resources. It's not exhaustive. You might just look at something for one of those different areas, for each of those individual areas of need, and think about what's available to support children with communication difficulties, with sensory difficulties and so on, and you could talk about those and try and access those. I know it's a big ask, but this is something that was part of that DFE criteria. Sometimes there's places where you can actually you can go and you can maybe visit a special school, a special needs school, where you're able to see this equipment, or bringing in a guest speaker who might bring in some of this equipment. Other equipment might be more widely available in the early years setting, but that might be something that you really have to put your thinking cap on to be able to think, okay, I've identified a couple of things for each of those 4 broad areas of need. How can I actually encourage and increase the confidence with some of these things for the students? Analyse and explain how cultural background and family circumstance can impact on babies and children's learning and development. So again, a very broad thing to start with, in terms of we all have our own experiences, we've all had different exposure into different family circumstances and so on, and then promoting that equality of opportunity for the education and care of a child with SEND. So, there might be limits and boundaries and set sort of ways of thinking and mindsets with parents and carers, with anybody, in terms of how to best care for a child with SEND. And it's about being sensitive to that. We talked about parents and carers, but it's also about working with that parent, working with that carer, to be able to really extend the possibilities for that child, to make sure that that full potential is being met, to make sure that those aspirations are in place, and that we're removing that medical model, we're removing those limits and boundaries, and we're really exploring and expanding that accessibility for the child. Now, some of those things were in bold, and that's the range statement. So it's for 1.1, it's just going to tell you there about that, the non-statutory, there's the SEND code of practice and the Equality Act 2010 there. So anything that's in bold will have further explanation there, and then you've got a link to those 2 things there within that specification, in case you were concerned about that or finding those. Okay, now the rest of those is probably just that baby qualification, because I just leave it on because I love it. Yeah, so we don't need to go into that, but we'll stop there and see if anybody has got any questions about this unit. I know we're at time. Sorry, Vivette.
That's okay. No, it's so interesting. I think one thing that struck me in this, well, two things. One is the inclusivity as a feeling is such a good point, because I think we can all relate, and it's a good thing to discuss with learners.
Yep.
When have they not felt included properly? Because you can be in the same room, you can be doing a
Yep.
similar activity, you can be spoken to and people be nice to you, but still not feel included. And I think if they can relate that to a time when they've been in that situation at home, at work, at school, maybe a family gathering at Christmas or whatever, they could then put themselves into that perspective for a child with a need or a disability. And the other thing is they working with parents. I think this would be a fantastic opportunity in this unit to get a guest speaker in, a parent with a child with SEND, that can talk about the way that they are often talked to and talked about by so-called professionals, and whether or not there are things that are said or ways that they are said that actually make the parent feel less included and part of what's going on for their children. Because I think I've done a lot of work with SEND in the past, and I think that's often a problem that occurs. So a nice thing to do would be to have a speaker in and get some real people to talk about what really happens in life, not what should happen.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We can't do right by the child if we're not doing right by the parent.
Exactly.
And we're not working in partnership. In an ideal world, it would be just a very, very, very sort of, we wouldn't have the child here and the parent and carer here in terms of our setting. We'd have them together, wouldn't we, with those overlapping circles. So
yeah. There's a question here. The Be Able To document recommends a PD on most of these. Are there any that must be done as a PD?
No, absolutely not. And so we have put that option in to use those different methods, and a professional discussion is something that lends itself in a very agile and flexible way. We just understand that whilst observation might well be a preferred method, if it's not possible, it's not possible, and therefore having that professional discussion. But I loved it when somebody mentioned, sorry, I can't remember who it was, but mentioned about bringing the SENDCO into that mix. I think it's a really good idea. So maybe a discussion between the student and the SENDCO that maybe then becomes a further expanded discussion between the student and you, to bring forward, well, I talked to the SENCO and this is what we were talking about. So to really extend it, or to be part of that conversation in the first place.
Ranjani, you've got a question?
Hi, Ms. Vivette. Thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, hi, Ms. Janet. So not a question, just wanted to add a testimonial here that 2 years back, a learner did her CACHE level 3, and she's a mother of 2 children, who one is fully autistic and another one is dyslexic. So she did her level 3, she enjoyed her course, but before that she was actually struggling as a parent. So years back, how their children were not accepted and were not included, and then she actually, because of a war, she had to literally flee from there with 2 children and leaving all her certificates and stuff. And then she migrated to another country to just for living and bringing them up while they were very little, and how she struggled. And later on, an educator supported her, and she's an SEN expert, and how both of them work together. And then the best part is the elder one, who is completely autistic, is now studying in a college 4th year in the UK. And then another child is actually studying in an university in Dubai, 2nd year, and is also going to go and join in UK, because this particular university have a branch over there. So both of them are doing really well. And she actually sat down and learned the curriculum to support her own 2 children with the help of the SENCO. And later on, now she's doing online curriculum for additional needs children in a wider perspective. So this testimonial, the way Ms. Janet was talking about how parent bonding, parent partnership. No more the EYP is working for children. She's working for children and their families and feeling inclusive. And I think, I was just thinking about it. So, in her own life, she actually struggled, and she used to say, Ms. Ranjani, you are my first teacher, because all my certificates are gone, and level 3 is the first thing that I'm doing again after a long, long time. So that gives a feeling of, yeah, we have been somewhere helpful for somebody to feel inclusive. So just wanted to place it here. Thank you so much for this unit 3. Thank you, Ms. Vivid. Thank you, Ms. Janet. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Right. There's another question here from Paula. Would a child need a diagnosed SEND, or could it be one you have suspected of having one? I know that EHCPs are not common in early years.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point, Paula. So there's very few education and healthcare plans within the early years, and it can take years. You might start the ball rolling in the early years, but sometimes it can take a long time. And I think the department as well are looking at education and healthcare plans, so they may well change in some way, shape or form in terms of what they look and feel like. So an absolute, you can use a concern. It might be a concern that doesn't warrant an education and healthcare plan, but actually does include some intervention from from the local authority as part of that local offer, but not necessarily something that's gone to that funding side of education and healthcare plan, where somebody will have something and that's guaranteed to be in place over that span of up to 25, follow them through their schooling, for example. So it doesn't have to be recognised through an EHCP.
Okay, thank you. Lisa.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got a childminder who is doing the level 3. She's only got, I think, 3 or 4 children. None of them have got any SEND or anything. Yeah. But her own 2 children who are older, I think they're 8 and 10, both have diagnosis for autism. Can I get her to use her own experience to reflect on this? So the equipment that she might have used in different schools and nurseries, and just her own experience, because it will be as a parent, but also I can get her to look at it professionally.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I would say is what you've just said, Lisa, in a way that you could extend on that. You could use that as maybe almost the case study in this particular scenario, and then think about how the SENCO could or would support. So it could become more hypothetical and extend it a little bit, just to make sure it tunes into to the criteria itself. But yeah, there's no reason why not. Absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions quickly while we've still got Janet here? We are a bit over time, but that's good. No, that's good, because we're learning so much, and I think that's, no one's run away, and people they can drop out without us even noticing, and they haven't. That's all good. Anything else? Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Janet. I think it has been really, really helpful. And obviously we're hoping you'll come back for Unit 4. And just looking at Unit 4, effective communication in an early years setting. I mean, how well does that trickle on from what we've just done with the special educational needs? Because it's all about communication, isn't it? So, I mean, and effective communication is so key to everything that we're trying to do, isn't it? And look after these children and so on.
Yeah.
So that's great.
Absolutely.
So, so we'll try and organise that. Is there a question just come through here? All right, just people saying thank you, and looking forward to the next session, which is great. And hopefully you'll pass the word, guys, to the rest of your teams, because these are such valuable sessions. Tasha has been recording it, so hopefully we'll be able to get that together and get it out to everybody quite soon. If you want a certificate of attendance for this session, which is always useful to go on your CPD, please just email support@laserlearning.co.uk, and if your name is on this list saying that you've attended today, then you will get one. Please don't ask your staff to apply for it because they haven't attended, but they are very, very welcome to listen to the recording afterwards, when you can share that around with everyone. Okay, thank you very much. We'll be in touch with the next session's dates and times. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.